Welcome everyone to this REL Pacific webinar about the goals, challenges, and implications of culturally responsive assessments. My name is Roger Fiedler and I'll be the MC for our session today. I'm the Communications Director at McREL, which administers the REL Pacific program on behalf of the U.S. Department of Education's Institute of Education Sciences. And I'm being supported today behind the scenes by several of my colleagues who work on the REL Pacific, including Kirsten Miller, our Communications Manager, who you'll see in the chat room today from time to time. Today's session is the third and final of 3 webinars on this topic, and I'll tell you more about the REL program and today's topic in just a moment. But first, I have just a couple of quick housekeeping reminders for today's session. First off, we're asking all participants to please leave your microphones and phone lines muted to help us avoid any feedback and to keep our audio clear for our presenters. And if you do have a question or comment during the session, please feel free to use the chat box. We'll be keeping an eye on the chat throughout the session, and we'll pause from time to time to answer your questions. And then we'll also be taking some time at the end of the session for any additional or final questions that come up. Our program today is scheduled to go for about an hour to an hour and a half, depending on how many questions we get and how much discussion there is as we go along. Please note that we are recording today's webinar, and after the session, we'll be sending slides and a copy of the recording and a survey link out to all registrants and participants in the coming days. So please do keep an eye out for emails from relpacific@mcrel.org. Speaking of the survey that I just mentioned, when we send it out, it will ask you to give us some feedback about how today's session went. Please do feel free to give us this feedback, as it helps us plan for future events and is also useful for our funder, the U.S. Department of Education's Institute of Education Sciences. Joining us today for our presentation, we have 3 content experts and presenters. Dr. Carla Evans is a senior associate at the National Center for the Improvement of Educational Assessment, where she's actively engaged with research and projects that evaluate the impacts of assessment on teaching and learning, and she helps schools bridge the gap between large-scale assessments and classroom-level assessments. Welcome, Carla. And Dr. Erika Landel is also a senior associate at the Center for Assessment, where she provides technical support to states and school systems on issues related to the design, development, implementation, and documentation of assessment and accountability systems. Welcome, Erika. And Kawi Sang is the director of the Hawaii Department of Education's Office of Hawaiian Education, where she's a leader of Hawaiian immersion programs in education that embody Native values, language, culture, and history as an integral part of the state's K-12 education standards. And welcome, Kawi. Now, for everybody joining us today, if you're not familiar with the REL Pacific or the REL programs in general, just to let you know a little bit about them, the regional educational laboratories are funded by the U.S. Department of Education's Institute of Education Sciences. And these 10 REL programs across the country and the Pacific region collaborate with local school districts and state departments of education, education policymakers, and other stakeholders to help them put research into action in schools. So in each of their assigned regions, the RELs conduct applied research, and they provide trainings to educators and system leaders, all with a mission of helping to support a more evidence-based education system and using research in ways that improve academic outcomes for students. And today's webinar is being sponsored by REL Pacific. REL Pacific serves educators and school systems in the state of Hawaii, the U.S. territories of American Samoa, Guam, and the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, and the island nations of the Federated States of Micronesia, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and the Republic of Palau. The REL Pacific team works with educators and leaders in each of these jurisdictions on research practice partnerships that focus on 5 high priority areas. And these are college and career readiness and success, professional learning, language and literacy, social and emotional learning, and data use and readiness. And several of these topics combine to lead us to today's webinar, where we are going to explore and discuss the goals and challenges and implications of developing and implementing culturally responsive assessments. And while this topic is certainly of high priority in the Pacific region, we know it's also of high interest across the nation. And we have participants joining us today from across the United States, from a variety of roles in schools, school districts, state departments, service agencies, universities, and more. So thank you all for joining us, and welcome to the session today. So let's take a moment to review our learning objectives for today's session.
Forget about it over there.
We will be presenting information and leaving the session with a stronger understanding of culturally responsive assessment and the differences between terminologies of culturally responsive, culturally relevant, culturally sensitive, and sustaining approaches to assessment. We'll also be providing an overview of the challenges of designing balanced assessment systems through a socio-cultural lens and implications of culturally responsive teaching and learning. And then lastly, we'll learn how culturally responsive assessments are implemented and supported in Hawaii schools through the Office of Hawaiian Education. For our agenda, to give you a quick overview of how we're going to sequence the session today, Carla Evans will lead us off with an overview of socio-cultural learning theory. Erika Landel will then follow with a perspective of culturally responsive assessment and balanced assessment systems. And then we'll hear again from Dr. Evans about a conceptual framework for classroom level assessments. And then Kawi Sang will provide us with some firsthand insights on how the Office of Hawaiian Education supports culturally responsive instruction and assessment in local school districts and schools. And with that, it's time now for me to turn things over to our first presenter. Carla, the stage is yours.
Great, thank you. Can you see my screen?
We can, thank you.
Okay, perfect. So I'm Carla Evans, as Roger said, and I just wanted to start this presentation sharing a little bit about my own impetus for this work and the state that I bring. So I'm a fellow traveler. I am a person who's curious about this. I definitely would not call myself a person who has it all figured out about culturally responsive assessment, but I am curious about how classrooms and learning spaces can better adapt to draw on students' cultural identities, their funds of knowledge, their assets. So I come in humility, I come bringing a spirit of openness, and I'm hoping we can have dialogue, even though it's a large group, and maybe even challenge some of the concepts and ideas we present today. There's a lot of work yet to be done around culturally responsive assessment. So I am going to start, as Roger said, really trying to define terms. So as I got into this work, I was really challenged to try to understand what's the difference between culturally sensitive education, culturally relevant, culturally responsive, culturally sustaining, like add your terms. Because for me, if I can't define it, if I can't understand it, then how can I think about what that means for assessment? And that's obviously the expertise that I bring. So that's the purpose of this first presentation, is to define terms and to situate what we're talking about also within sociocultural learning theory. We start with the problem that we're trying to solve, however, in discussing culturally relevant and responsive assessment. So our conversation today really boils down to educational equity. And I really appreciate this quote by Adeyemi Stembridge. So please read along with me, it's on the screen. The word equity embodies the belief that we will see achievement in all student groups when all students receive opportunities that they are able to perceive as meaningful, that allow them to draw on their social and cultural literacies in order to be academically successful. And what I really appreciate about Dr. Stembridge's work is this idea that equity is an idea that's demonstrated in our work. So it's about beliefs lived out through actions and choices made relative to teaching techniques, curriculum choices, educational policy decisions. Equity requires action. And Stembridge talks about this as equity as a performance concept. And I see that as grounding our work today, because the way in which we're going to be talking about culturally fill-in-the-blank assessment or education, whether that's responsive, relevant, fill in your term, is that it is lived out in our performance. So in this first presentation, we will briefly discuss sociocultural learning theory as the foundation, culturally responsive pedagogy as the mindset, and culturally responsive assessment as the practice that derives from the earlier two. So I'm not going to obviously go into depth about sociocultural learning theory in 15 minutes, but I just wanted to point out a few ways in which it's distinct, and that the ways in which that grounds our notions of culturally responsive assessment. And one part of that is that the way in which the nature of learning is understood is that knowledge is distributed amongst people in their environments. So students must be afforded genuine participation in the activities and the concerns of the group. And the implications, therefore, on the design of culturally responsive assessment or any recipe, right? The National Research Council report, How People Learn, talks about what's the relationship between learning theories and the design of learning environments. And it's not a one-to-one, but they use this example of physics constrains, but it doesn't dictate how to build a bridge. And similarly, the advances in the science of learning raise important questions, they state. This is from the How People Learn report, in which learning environments are designed. And it specifically, what is taught, how it's taught, and how it's assessed. So sociocultural assessment means observing and analyzing how students use their knowledge, their skills, their processes to participate in the real work of a community. So sociocultural perspectives on assessment are critical because, as Pam Moss says, assessment practices do far more than provide information, understandings about what's important to learn, what learning is, who learners are. So that's our first bucket, sociocultural learning theory. Our second bucket is focusing on the mindset of culturally relevant or responsive pedagogy. So switching to that, we believe it's imperative to discuss pedagogy first, because if we don't know or we can't define or explain what does it mean to teach or instruct in culturally relevant or responsive ways, how could we ever discuss how to assess in culturally relevant or responsive ways, right? Like, we have to start first, what does this look like in instruction? So I'm actually going to play about 4-minute video, because it's that good, where you are going to hear experts from the field of culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy define what it means. So as you're listening, please consider how they define culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy. They really focus on relevant, but they do talk a little bit about responsive. And as you're listening, please type your response in the chat. So how are they defining it? And go ahead for yourself and define it based upon what you hear in the chat as we listen.
I think people, when they use the term culturally responsive or culturally relevant pedagogy, forget that the base of the word is culture. So culture has to do with worldviews, beliefs, language. It has to do with values.
Culture, to me, at its essence, are the
Sorry about that.
things that, those filters that help us as human beings make sense out of the most ordinary things. Culture can be grouped into two different kind of categories. You can talk about visible culture and invisible culture, or tangible and intangible. The tangible, I would translate that to say the crafts, the music, the art, the technology. And those are important, but I think the more important are the intangible. And these are values, beliefs, feelings, opinions, perspectives, assumptions.
So culturally relevant pedagogy, one of the primary premises is that teachers take students' everyday lived.
Folks, I'm not sure what happened there. It might have been that Carla has lost her connection. So Erika, I'm wondering if we could go ahead to your section of the agenda, and we'll just pick up from your section.
You know what? I think I'm going to turn my video off just so we make sure that we don't have any problems. So hi, everyone. I'm Erika Landel, and I'm going to go off video right now. And I'm so sorry that you didn't get to hear the end of Carla's presentation. Hopefully she'll be able to get back and you can hear it, because it really is fantastic. I saw a few people in the chat saying that they've seen that video, which is great. So what I wanted to talk about is what culturally responsive assessment looks like within the context of a balanced assessment system. And specifically, how do the purposes and uses often associated with assessments at different levels of an assessment system influence the manner and degree to which cultural relevance can be addressed? And so I come at this very similar to Carla, very humble in terms of I've been thinking about this with respect to my role at the center, but also as someone who is a co-lead for the Balanced Assessment Systems Collaborative as part of CCSSO, as states are thinking about how to address some of these issues with cultural relevance as they're designing assessment systems. So I know that we just saw this slide and we just saw this quote, but I love it too. You know, in the last section, Carla talked about equity being an idea that's demonstrated in our work. And so educational equity is not a condition to be met. You know, we can't look at the results of a test and say, yes, you know, we've achieved educational equity. Equity is demonstrated through the thoughtful design of inputs and mechanisms that serve to ensure all students have an opportunity to learn and subsequently demonstrate what they know and can do. You know, so if we think about assessment, assessment is fundamentally a process that we use to inform educational decision-making. So to demonstrate the principles and ideas of equity in assessment, those who select or design the tools of assessment, whether those be formal or informal tools, must do so with an understanding of the way in which a student's culture and background can interact with student performance. But at the same time, anyone who's ever been in that position where they're designing or selecting assessments, at the same time, you have to be cognizant of the characteristics that an assessment must have in order for you to be able to use the results as intended. And so sometimes these characteristics, the things that we need the assessment to do, are in conflict with efforts to design in a way that accounts for students' unique cultures and backgrounds. And so it's this tension that I want to talk a little bit about in my model, and I'm extending on something in Carla's model that you haven't seen yet, darn it. So we'll see how this goes. Is Carla back on by chance?
It doesn't look like it yet, Erika, and
Okay.
I'm keeping an eye out for her.
That would be great, because if she does come back on by the time her slide comes on, I'll let her do that one first. So first off, what I wanted to do is just really quickly reflect on what we mean when we talk about a balanced assessment system. So an assessment system, as many of you have probably heard me and others at the center talk about, is not just a compilation of tests, right? We're talking about a network of tools that are selected or designed to work together to provide stakeholders at multiple levels of the educational system with coherent information about how students are performing, right? And in this context, coherence has a very clear meaning. Within a coherent system, assessments are tied to a common understanding of how students come to acquire knowledge in a content domain, and there's clear expectations for performance, right? So it's this idea of coherence that allows for student performance to be evaluated in a meaningful way over time for us to look at progress and growth, and also to provide useful information about teaching and learning, right? So this graphic is intended to demonstrate those kind of characteristics of a balanced assessment system. And this is just a nice slide. I have to give credit to my colleague, Nathan Dadion. It's just a nice overview. So a balanced assessment system is where you have multiple assessments with potentially different designs sponsored by different people working at different levels of the educational system, right? They're coordinated by this common theory of learning or understanding of how we acquire knowledge. And they work together to provide information that can be used specific ways, right? So it establishes this profile of information that can be used in the ways that the stakeholders need it. So in her presentation, which she did not finish, Carla suggested that developing kind of formal standardized assessments that meet or go beyond what we refer to and what she has in this trajectory that I'll show you in just a second as culturally sensitive, moving beyond culturally sensitive to something that would be kind of more culturally sustaining is really difficult. It's a difficult task. And so what I want to do is talk a little bit more about why that's the case. So this slide presents one representation of a hypothetical balanced assessment system. So what you've got is different assessments associated with different levels of the educational system that have been selected or designed by different stakeholders for specific purposes. All right, so you've got your state in this case, you've got your statewide summative assessment being used for school accountability and resource allocation. You have a district selected or just developed interim assessment being used for resource allocation and monitoring progress. And then finally, you have your classroom assessments that are being used to inform formative assessment process. So now what we want to do is think a little bit about the characteristics and features of assessments that are designed to support these different goals and uses that are represented in this kind of trajectory here by different levels of the educational system. As we talked about, I think it was in the first REL Pacific webinar, assessments are designed to support specific purposes and uses, right? So for example, an assessment that's intended to support and inform a state school accountability system has to be developed to support inferences about students' proficiency on the content standards, right? And those content standards are end of year expectations. And so the assessment is typically given at the end of the year. In addition, since results are intended to be aggregated and compared across schools and students and districts, standardization, comparability of scores, and security are necessary design features. Now, in contrast, for classroom assessment designed to provide information that supports instruction, they're intended to be flexible, individualized, and in most cases, they're not secure. So what you can see is that you've got these distinct uses here, but there's a continuum underneath with respect to a lot of characteristics and features that need to be taken into account. And these are the characteristics and features that can sometimes make it a little bit more difficult to move toward cultural sensitivity, move from cultural sensitivity to culturally sustaining types of assessment. So this is the slide that I was hoping Carla would be on to present. So she worked a lot on thinking about this, and I'm not going to do it justice, and so I apologize for that. But what she was trying to do is think about all these terms related to culturally fill in the blank education, right? So you hear about culturally sensitive, culturally relevant, responsive, and sustaining. And she was trying to think about how to distinguish these in a way that made sense, right? And she used the icons above the continuum to try and demonstrate differences among this trajectory. So culturally sensitive education is when you're aware that cultural differences and similarities between people exist without assigning them value. Okay, so you're aware, in this case, there's the I. Culturally relevant education is when you have this linkage. And so you can see she's got the chain link there. So students' heritage and community cultural practices are resources to honor and explore. Teachers take students' everyday lived cultural experiences and they make the appropriate linkages to the intended learning, all right? So their teachers serve as kind of a cultural translator and bridge. Culturally responsive education, she is equating to being more adaptive to students. So teachers see students as sources of knowledge, full of concepts and bearers of information. So students have these assets that can be brought to bear and leveraged to help students learn. And then finally, culturally sustaining education is where students' heritage and community cultural practices are resources to honor, explore, and extend, right? And so youth are producers of culture as well as consumers. So you can see that there's different ways of thinking about, this is a different trajectory in terms of the way in which culture is addressed within education.
So Erika, it looks like Carla did just join us, just so you're aware. It looks like we just got her back.
Carla!
Sorry, guys.
That's all right. You know what? I was just showing your slide as an FYI, and I kind of read through it, but I wanted to give you a second to talk about it because you thought about it so much and it's so great.
Where did I get cut off? I literally have been trying to get back on, so I don't even know where I got cut off.
You got cut off in the middle of the video.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah, so I guess that, I won't belabor this because I don't want to hold us up, but the idea of, and I'm holding my phone, sorry about this, the idea of the stepping ladder was basically to attach an icon and an image to these 4 different terms to make them clear, right? And so sensitive being awareness of culture, and relevance being something that links. And so that was the idea of the linking there, that it's the cultural translators that Geneva Gay and the other experts on that video talked about that you didn't finish. And the third is responsiveness, so the adapting to students' needs within schooling context, and then sustaining being extension. And so then I was talking to myself apparently about large scale assessment and the struggles around even just being culturally sensitive. So I'll end there so you can keep going.
Thanks, Carla. That was so much better than what I just did with reading. So, so anyway, what I was going to say is, in her presentation, Carla presented this continuum. So it differentiates these different degrees of attending to culture and education. And when I was thinking about that, I was so impressed with that. I was trying to say, okay, so let's try to translate this discussion around pedagogy to assessment. Not that they're distinct, but specifically, given those previous definitions, how would we distinguish between culturally sensitive, relevant, responsive, and sustaining assessment practices? So at one end here, and again, this is just my way of trying to think about and make that translation. When you have culturally sensitive assessment, so in this case, you've got tools of assessment are designed essentially with an awareness of cultural differences and the potential impact that insensitivity to those differences might have, like by perpetuating oppression and stereotypes, or potentially interrupting our ability to make accurate inferences, right? So I think when you look at current attempts to make modifications to processes supporting large-scale summative assessment, or more of these formal interim assessments, that they would kind of fall in this particular realm. And then you can move along this continuum. And I'm not going to go through all of these, so culturally relevant here, you would have tools that strive more to measure understanding in a way that will be relevant to the student by somehow linking to and acknowledging culture and community. Right. And so you're trying to get a little bit more closer to the student and provide opportunities. I've seen this, what comes to mind, and it's because I'm a little bit closer to it, is what they do in Chicago Public Schools with the Cultural Curriculum Equity Initiative. They've really worked hard, kept stakeholders involved to try and make all of the curriculum materials and assessments culturally relevant. I'm just going to move to the other end here to the sustaining. So in this case, where you've got cultural sustaining, and this, I was thinking, these are where the tools are essentially designed by the student, right, to allow for individual beliefs and cultures to be highlighted and extended. Remember, that was that addition, to extend in the demonstration of knowledge. And I think what you see here, or at least what I was seeing, is that when you're moving from the left to the right in this continuum, you see a change in the degree to which test content and expectations are essentially designed to support flexible opportunities, right, for students to demonstrate their understanding. Because flexibility and comparability tend to work against one another, assessments that are designed to support uses that necessitate strict score comparability or security or standardization usually can't move that far to the right. And I think that goes to what Carla was saying just a few seconds ago. This is where there's a tension with large scale summative assessments and even some of these commercial vendor assessments. In general, to support the development of assessments that are, or to have assessment processes and tools that are more responsive and sustaining, you're going to have to look toward instruction. That's going to happen more in the process of assessments potentially developed by schools and teachers. Now, this doesn't mean that nothing can be done to improve on or move the needle on standardized large scale summative or interim assessments. Carla had a few slides that you didn't get to see that were talking about some of the great work and thinking that Jennifer Randall has been doing, and also Susan Lyons, who I show here, to try and push the needle in thinking about how we evaluate and interrogate our existing assessment designs and development processes to meet the challenges of, in this case, confronting inequity. So in her call to action, Susan Lyons and others kind of provide recommendations that are specifically focused on innovation and large scale test design. And you can see here the table of contents, and this is available. It's also looking at how we address not only test design, but psychometric procedures, scoring, and reporting. And so I know this is kind of a whirlwind, and I know hopefully we'll have Carla back in a little bit, but I wanted to just finish by kind of throwing out there 3 recommendations for designing for equity in a balanced assessment system. And the first one is to focus on the construct. So the conversation about equity and cultural relevance shouldn't begin and end with assessment, right? So the sole focus can't be on how do we make the assessment more relevant or sensitive. I think you really need to look for the through lines. And in this case, the content standards serve as the expectations for what students should know and be able to do within a grade, and they reflect or should reflect an inherent theory of learning for how kids come to acquire knowledge in a domain. So thinking about the content standards and how they're operationalized, not just how, but what they mean. So what are those expectations and how can students demonstrate performance of those expectations is one place where I think we can really move the needle. So having stakeholders be involved in the process of articulating, reviewing, evaluating content standards is a way that you have a through line, because those expectations will be represented in your learning goals and hopefully then in instruction, curriculum, and assessment. It can't just happen in one piece. And one thing I wanted to say, and I didn't put it on here, but a great quote, Randy Bennett calls on assessments to be born socio-culturally responsive. And I think that thinking about the construct, not waiting till you get to the point of assessment design is the way to do that, or one way to do that. The second is attending to the theory of action, and everyone who knows me knows that I love theories of action. They're simply arguments that serve to clarify how the design of your system aligns with your values and priorities. And we really believe that any assessment system has to start with a clearly defined theory of action. And inherent in that theory of action really should be a discussion related to the role of assessment in supporting your district or school's vision related to equity, right? So there should be a vision and a definition that you put forward. What is equity? How is it going to be demonstrated? And how will not only be demonstrated within the components of your assessment system, but how is it also demonstrated in other initiatives that are happening within your educational system? And finally, I want to make sure we have enough time here. Oh, and I just included this little quote from Chicago Public Schools. And so again, they define equity as championing the individual cultures, identities, talents, abilities, languages, and interests of each student by ensuring they receive the necessary opportunities and resources to meet their unique needs and aspirations. So it's very similar to that quote. It's what you do, right? And these are the things we need to do to get in touch with equity. And then finally, working with vendors, I think is another way that you can try to support this move toward culturally relevant assessment. So, prior to selecting an assessment or an assessment development vendor, a district or school or even a state needs to clarify their expectations related to equity. And this goes back to not only having a clear definition, but also, taking some time to say, okay, what processes and mechanisms do we expect vendors to have in place to promote our vision, to demonstrate that equity is a belief that they hold important? What actions or activities that are unique to your context do you want to have in place? in order to support your move toward equity. You know, cognitive labs, you know, to what extent do you want to be able to make changes to an assessment? To what extent do you want to have stakeholders engaged in the development and design process? And then you go and have conversations with vendors to say, okay, what are you doing and how can we put some of our vision into this process? And clearly there's a lot of factors that'll input the amount of impact that you can have on that assessment, but it's definitely worthwhile to think about before you adopt assessment and have something in place. So I'm going to stop there. Because we started so quickly, I didn't get a chance to put my timer on, so I really hope I didn't go over by too long. But just wanted to say thanks for the opportunity and looking forward to conversation at the end of the session. All right, let me.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Erika. And now, Carla, if you're back with it, looks like you are because you're ready to go, coming back to talk a little bit about classroom level assessments.
Okay, I hope I don't freeze again. I sincerely apologize for that. So this section is about a conceptual framework for culturally responsive classroom assessment. So the impetus for this work came as a result of some work that we're doing in Hawaii with the Hawaii Department of Education around a large-scale performance assessment initiative that is meant to provide high-quality curriculum-embedded performance assessments across the state that teachers can use. So not for high stakes use, but for classroom summative use. And so the question then arose, well, culture is very significant and important in the Hawaiian context. And in my previous work, I've done large scale performance assessment design in many states. It's honestly not been a huge issue, and meaning like the topic hasn't come up. So as we started to work with educators in Hawaii, I started to dig into, well, what's out there that really helps to define what does it mean to design a performance assessment that's culturally responsive. And so this framework comes out of that context. And so it's meant to be situated in this larger conversation of what is culturally responsive education and how can classroom assessment support that type of teaching and learning. And so to kick us off here, you can never go wrong with Gloria Ladson-Billings, where she states all instruction is culturally responsive. The question is, to which culture is it currently oriented? And to riff off of that quote, I wanted to just show you one example of a performance assessment from those group from Hawaii that was created this summer as part of our work. It's draft, it's, you know, we're still working with educators on these. But this is for grade 7 math. And what I want you to think about as I read, because the text is small, and I'm not going to read every single part of this, but does this seem like something you see in your classrooms or that you saw when you were a student, or that's typical in your context? Or do you notice something else about the way in which this performance assessment was designed? So I'm going to just read the top part of it. In Hawaii, 85% of the food we consume is shipped to the islands. The reliance on imported food is not ideal because of the potential disasters that prevent ships from arriving. Sorry, I get all these notifications when people come in from arriving in Hawaii. The current and future residents of Hawaii need your help to achieve food security, which is defined by the U.S. Department of Agriculture as access by all people at all times to enough food for an active, healthy life. So this is a performance task. I'm just pause here on equations and inequalities. That's the big idea. It's designed to assess. And so the rest of the context here is you have this amount of money, you have this much square feet of growing space to start your food farm. You're going to use this information provided, and you're going to do something with it. So it's not so much that I want to focus our conversation on the specifics of this task. But what I want to bring your attention to, and what I'd love to see in the chat, if you get a second here, is does this seem like something that you see in typical classroom practice? Classroom assessments, this is obviously was written for Hawaii students, but is this something that you see that this context, this performance assessment context, this scenario, if you will, something that you see? I don't see any in the chat yet. So I'm hoping I'm not frozen. Maybe Roger can be like, no, we can hear you. Okay. Does this seem like something that you see in typical classrooms? No. Yes. Thank you, Carrie. Not at all. Right. So this is one of the reasons why I think drawing attention and maybe using a framework that I'm going to present here in a minute can really help draw attention. And I appreciate, Peggy, your notice about it looks very localized. And that was the whole point of this. So 3 takeaways from this presentation section, I'm hoping that you take away is first, that curriculum and instruction that serves the needs of all students and student groups should drive assessment design. And I'm talking about classroom assessment design right now. Assessment doesn't operate in a vacuum in classrooms, and it should always cohere with our learning theory, with state content standards and high quality curriculum and instruction. Second, no single teaching or assessment strategy alone will make anything or anyone culturally responsive. And so we're going to talk about what am I talking about with respect to culturally responsive? Like, it's not just a strategy. We're going to talk about it as a mindset. And in other words, there are mindsets that support more culturally responsive curriculum, instruction, and assessment decisions in schools. And Stembridge talks about this in the sense of having mental models, that CRE, or culturally responsive education, is a mental model. It helps to identify themes and tools of practice. And sorry, I'm just trying to get to the next slide here. And it occurs when instruction is more personalized, it's more localized, as Peggy said in the chat. It engages students. Students feel the learning experience is designed with them in mind. They're not just widgets and robots, right? They are people and they have assets to bring. Student background and language is leveraged, and previous learning background outside of school, inside of school, all of that highlight pathways to further engagement. So in the forefront of our minds for this entire discussion of this framework in a minute that I'm going to present, I think it's important that we always keep in the forefront of our minds who are the students we're assessing, what matters to them, what cultural capital and other assets do they bring, and what and how are we assessing that intentionally draws on those assets. And this is so important for classroom assessment and such the perfect place for it, because teachers can adapt their curriculum, instruction, and assessment to meet their students' needs. And what you didn't hear me present earlier was some of the challenges in large-scale assessment around this. So this intentionally focuses on the classroom level. There are lots of different CRE frameworks, and I built this work off of Adiyemi Stembridge's work from the book that's on the slide here. So he is talking about culturally responsive education in the classroom, pedagogy. Remember, we said, if you don't know what it looks like instructionally, how can you assess? So I took his work and said, okay, if this is what it means pedagogically to teach with this mindset in the classroom, what's the echo of that in the assessment realm, right? My expertise is classroom assessment. Well, what would that look like if we transferred that and his 6 themes of culturally responsive education into a classroom assessment context? And so these are the 6 themes of CRE from Adiyemi Stembridge's work. And I'm going to go through each of them and describe what they are. They are interrelated. And so even though I'm going to talk about them separately, in practice, they really do overlap and they're impossible to separate. But we did find that this helped us to, it afforded certain conversations with Hawaii educators this summer and ongoing about the design of classroom performance assessments. And I think it could do that in other classroom assessment contexts as well. So engagement, as we all know, engagement is a theme and a goal. CRE for culturally responsive education. It's a critical aspect of learning, right? Like if students aren't engaged, you're not teaching them anything. And there's different kinds of engagement. There's cognitive engagement, there's affective engagement. With respect to classroom assessment design, I'm going to talk about 2 applications and ways of thinking about student engagement. One is to allow students to have more ownership or agency over either what, when, how, or some combination of those, or one of those, how, what, when they demonstrate their learning. And this notion is often called student-led assessment. It falls along a continuum from more teacher-led to more student-led. Supports assessment processes and products that are more meaningful to students because they had agency, they had some choice and voice over the decisions that were made. And so one way to check on engagement during classroom assessment design or evaluation is to ask the following question that's listed in gray on the slide. How does the assessment engage students? So behaviorally, can they collaborate with others? Are there hands-on investigations? Are they affectively involved because they can emotionally connect to the content, it interests them? Or cognitively, because the rigor of the assessment is an intellectual challenge. And that's where it relates to rigor, right? We said these are very much, these 6 themes are related. Rigor is another theme of CRE, and it's not about difficulty. Like, I can give you the most obscure question about World War II, and yeah, it'll be really difficult, but it's really just a very low level cognitive process. It's fact recall. So what I'm talking about here is cognitive rigor, the mental processes that are eliciting higher order thinking. And so one way to think of that, there's the example on the slide of, you can have a low level question like, what are the 3 branches of the US government? Select all that apply. That's very much fact recall. And then if you want to get more rigorous and you want to think about this in a classroom assessment context, describe and analyze a current or historic event in federal or state history that highlights the structure and function of the 3 branches of the government. Provide rationale for your chosen event, right? You can really see the differences in rigor, and rigor is a key theme for culturally responsive assessment. We're not changing the target. We are focusing on rigor. And engagement and rigor go together. So when a task is cognitively rigorous, students must be actively engaged in doing something, demonstrating something, producing something, performing. So, and on the flip side of that, students are only authentically engaged, especially cognitively engaged, in the presence of rigor. So one way to check on rigor during assessment, classroom assessment design and evaluation, is to ask, how does the assessment design encourage students to, or elicit, higher order thinking skills? In what ways are students led to construct their own meaning and interpretations from content when completing the assessment? So that would imply that there's not just one solution, fill in the blank, right? There's multiple solution paths, multiple answers are possible because it's about justification, explanation, reasoning, higher order thinking. The third theme of the 6 is cultural identity. The video that you saw half of does a really nice job talking about the different layers of culture, right? There's this Zaretta Hammond's culture tree metaphor I have on the slide here, but there's different ways of thinking about this, but I really like her image here of these leaves, right? Which you can see, it's often referred to as the surface level, what you can see. Food, fashion, festivities, right? And sometimes we just think culture is that, but obviously it's not. There is, it's hidden, it's in the trunk of the tree. It's maybe not very deep like the roots, but there's things that are unobservable that have to do more with our cultural beliefs. So things like courtesy, conversational patterns, interpersonal behavior, concepts of time, personal space, rules of conduct. And then even deeper than that, Stembridge talks about this as like the Nana test. Like, what would your Nana say? How do you decide what's good or bad? How do you understand and see the world and get a sense of what's acceptable or not acceptable? And so we know culture is fluid and dynamic. We're multicultural beings in one way or another. But during classroom assessment design and evaluation, I think there's ways to think about cultural identity that can prompt teachers to ask, in what ways does the assessment make reference to culture? How does the assessment allow students to draw from their cultural knapsacks? You can use different language here. These are pretty much saying the same thing in 3 different ways, right? How does the assessment support students in bridging their social or cultural identities with their academic identities? And again, I think it's sometimes just bringing it to the front. At least that's been my very limited experience in this area of performance assessment design. Just asking the question itself changes the conversation about classroom assessment design and evaluation. The fourth is about relationships. Relationships are the channel through which a student's investment in school is personalized. So students have a right to school. Their identity and their school identity can coexist with other identities. And that meaningful relationships with individuals in school can extend to relationships with academic content. That's a quote from Adeyemi Sturridge's book. And I think relationships can be often integrated into classroom assessments through collaboration. So collaboration is a 21st century skill. We do it a lot in formative assessment and formative instruction and with classroom activities, but also within the context of classroom assessment. How can students work interdependently? So I'm not talking about parallel play here. I'm talking about working together interdependently towards a group goal. How can they do that in a way that helps them to enhance or deepen their learning? Vulnerability. One way to think about vulnerability is to think about the threats that students face with respect to two aspects. One is the content of learning, and the second is the learning environment. So if we think about the content of learning first, if students aren't well prepared to take a classroom assessment that's rigorous or to succeed, we have put them into a vulnerable position. And so teachers must provide adequate formative instruction and assessment experiences, feedback, modeling, all of those things we know are best practices to support student risk-taking and to respect that students can live up to our expectations, but we also are responsible as teachers and educators to support them in doing so. And then with respect to the learning environment, it matters how students treat each other and talk to each other in the classroom. It matters how teachers talk to students and how others. So students need to be able to trust their peers and others and expect the learning environment is going to support them. And in this way, vulnerability is related to rigor and relationships. It enables risks with content, teachers, and their peers. And so the question at the bottom of the slide related to classroom assessment is, how does the assessment design and really the instruction that took place before it to prepare them for that assessment encourage appropriate student risk-taking because they are prepared. They have been supported and scaffolded to that learning. And then finally, the sixth theme of CRE from Stembridge's work is about assets. So assets are used by students when they're faced with a challenging question, problem, task. So the two different frameworks are on here. One is about habits of mind. So students use these habits of mind in response to something that they don't know immediately, right? A problem or a question. That's when you use a habit of mind. It doesn't, when you don't just get it like this and you have to think about it, you bring up, do students persist? Do they manage their impulsivity? Do they think flexibly, apply past knowledge, right? They do that in the face of rigorous expectations. And similarly, do students draw on their cultural capitals when they're faced with challenging assessment questions, problems, or tasks? And so rigorous assessments require students to use these assets to demonstrate their knowledge and skills. It elicits it, it embeds it. So if it's helpful, this is an inventory that I put together that basically uses Stembridge's 6 themes and these questions to look familiar. They're the questions on the previous slides. And the idea for this inventory was basically to provide a way to have conversations. I'm putting it in the chat right now. It's open access for teachers to ask themselves questions about their classroom assessments. Like, have I considered rigor or engagement? You know, not every classroom assessment is going to meet all these points. That's not the intention here. But it is the case that as we start to move towards more culturally responsive teaching and learning practices, that our assessments need to follow that. And so if this inventory is helpful for anyone, feel free to use, remix, redistribute. And then finally here, this final slide here is when I think about these 6 themes, and I think about how do these 6 themes apply to classroom assessment in particular, and with a focus, except for vulnerability, on summative classroom assessment, I don't think you could talk about these 6 themes without thinking about these bullets. There's more, this is not exhaustive, but like when we're talking about engagement, you have to talk about student-led assessment. Talking about cultural identity, you have to think about authentic assessment experiences that really pull on that idea of socio-cultural assessment. Relationships, how do we embed collaboration? Vulnerability, really maximizing formative assessment processes within the classroom, not using grades as motivators. Assets, eliciting students' assets in the design of our classroom assessments. And then rigor, focusing on higher order thinking, transfer, deeper learning, and cross-content connections. So these are just, I think, the baseline, not the ceiling for sure. Additional resources I'll leave to you at your leisure around classroom assessment, particularly culturally responsive. There's not tons out there. There's a lot out there related to instruction, but these are some, if that is helpful for you. And now I'm going to turn it over to Callie.
All right, I'm going to jump in really quick here. Thank you, Carla. And to reintroduce, we are honored to have Cowie Sang from the Office of Hawaiian Education join us now to share some firsthand perspective of how this type of thinking and perspective is being applied to Hawaii schools. So Cowie, the stage is yours, and Kanoa, if you could get, there we go, all set to go.
Elina mai kako me ke aloha wau iho no o Cowie Sang no wai manalo mai au e ke noho ni me ia'u ku'umau kupuna o Abby punia po oi laua o Sunny Kaipo Amok Sang pa'apu me ku'umau kupuna maka'au ku'umama o Manu Ehu Kupahu laua o Elizabeth Kaloko o Kamaile Kapana. Ke lawi ia ni nai no ku'umau kupuna me nā kupuna o ko'u aina o Hawaii me ke aloha nui no kumako aina me kumako kanaka. Aloha, my name is Cowie Sang, and today I sit here with my kupuna on my father's side, Sunny Kaipo Amok Sang and Abigail Punia Po'oi, and on my mother's side, Nanya Ehu Kupahu and Elizabeth Kaloko Kamaile Kapana. I also bring the aina that I'm from, which is Hawaii, and more specifically, Waimanalo. And the picture that I'm sharing here today in this slide represents sort of the result of the intergenerational transference of kuleana in my ohana to the place that we were bred, the place that we were born and raised in, to the place that fed us. It's an example of the 4th generation of my ohana living in that space and taking on the same kuleana that my kupuna, my grandparents, took on when this was their aina, and this was where they lived. I share this picture sort of as a space to think about, and sorry, this slide is not moving forward. Sort of to think about where we are as a lahui, as a group of people that come from a specific place, a specific aina, and as a group of people who include that aina as part of our ohana and part of our family, and we acknowledge as our grandparents and our kupuna. I was asked to participate in this panel today, and I'm not exactly sure whether or not I fit the box based on what we've heard so far. So I'll try my best to kind of stay sort of in alignment with some of the messaging that we heard today around assessment. But I think part of the way this part of the presentation is set up is to tell a story that actually doesn't start with, and I have contemplated whether or not I should put more than just the missionary arrival on this timeline here, but to start a little bit with the story about knowledge systems, and particularly the knowledge system of Hawaii. Prior to the arrival of the missionary, I think the missionaries into Hawaii there was a thriving Lahui that lived in this space in Hawaii. And they had their knowledge system and they had their knowledge practices and they had ways to transfer that knowledge across generations. Mayoki Kilo Mai from a really long time ago. And then as we start to see the introduction of a new culture into Hawaii, with the arrival of the missionaries and Christianity, I think we start to see sort of a shift and sort of an imposition in a new culture upon Kanaka Hawaii. And then we start to see the way we were educating our people start to shift as well. And the target start to move away from the knowledge systems of our kupuna to an introduced knowledge system. And so that sort of starts to happen because the way that the materials that are starting to be printed being printed into the printing press that was bought by the missionaries starts with, making sure that students can read and write. Hawaiian people could read and write in a language so that they could start to receive the message of Christianity. I think the benefit of that was that it drove Hawaiians to become a very literate culture, a very literate culture in terms of print literacy. And then, fast forwarding to sort of the institutionalization of public schools in Hawaii, our people were still learning to read and write and do all of those things that were now an introduced knowledge system, but they were doing it in their language, in the language of Hawaii. As the overthrow of our Queen Liliuokalani takes place in 1893, and just previous to that in the 1860s, we start to see this movement and this intentional driving to disconnect Hawaiians from their language and from their culture. And the more that would happen, I think the more that there would be a shift in the power structure in Hawaii. And so that the new sort of colonial knowledge systems could sort of shift the placement of power away from Native Hawaiians and into the hands of the colonizer. So that's happening in the late 1800s, and then throughout the territorial years, all the way to the statehood. Fortunately for us, though, cultural practitioners didn't go away. They continued to practice those things that were no longer a part of the dominant culture of Hawaii through the early 1900s. And in the 1960s, we start to see a resurgence of hula practice. And through that resurgence of hula practice, we also start to see a reclamation of authority to be able to use our language, Olelo Hawaii, as a mechanism for educating our people. In 1978, those leaders, through a constitutional convention, put into public policy language that said that Olelo Hawaii should be and is an official language of the state of Hawaii. And then we start to see the movement of Olelo Hawaii starting to show up in our public education systems. I do want to acknowledge that some of the early founders of that movement sit in this room today. So I want to acknowledge Keiki Kawai'aia and Dr. Ka'isai, who are in the audience as well as sort of those early movement and movers and shakers of that movement. Fast forwarding now into the public education system, and particularly the Department of Education system, we start to see with the introduction of NCLB, this need to sort of link the funding of education to a single assessment tool of a single language in our public education system. And that starts to throw things off in terms of the natural trajectory that our Hawaiian language immersion schools, or Kulakaiapuni, had been grounded in. But the Department of Education since 2005 and 2010, when they were trying to create assessments that were grounded in English language, had recognized that that wasn't gonna, that wasn't going to work for our students, but also it didn't provide any kind of equity to the status of Olelo Hawaii as an official language of our state. And so what we, oops, sorry, oh, there we go. And so as that movement starts to take place, I think a lot of the early stages of our Hawaiian language immersion program was driven by the community. And it was somebody asked a question about whether or not you could keep politics out of that movement. And I think the answer is absolutely not. Because if we're talking about sort of shifting the power structure and shifting the power dynamic of our education system, then that is a very political action. But I think it was also very important that took place, because by the time we start seeing standardized assessments show back up in our system, it starts to sort of create this separation. I think folks call it the achievement gap, right? I call it a separation. I call it cultural dissonance. It creates this huge gap between how Native Hawaiians are performing in our system and how other populations are performing in our system. And I think part of that movement is now to say, look, we've created an achievement gap in our public education system that we think the contributing factors might be around economic, socioeconomic status and other things. But I think on the side of culture-based education, folks needed to explore whether or not there was something else besides socioeconomic status that might be influencing the way Native Hawaiian students in particular were performing in our public education system. And this action started to be, this kind of question started to surface at the leadership level of our public education system, particularly with the Board of Education. And they were asking those kinds of questions, and they were saying, are we providing equity for both languages in our system or not? And if we aren't, then what should we do about it? And so this schematic here that you see here actually kind of came up out of that conversation from the Board of Education in about 2014, where they start to sort of literally draw it out on the back of a napkin to say, look, we have two languages here in our system. And currently, we're only resourcing the education system that drives folks to English outcomes. We have to sort of erase that and figure out how do we make sure that we're driving and resourcing education so that all students in our system, our public education system, are receiving the same kind of treatment to reach college, career, and community readiness. And the language shouldn't be the thing that causes one program to get more resources over the other. And so this was a really critical shift, I think, in that process. I don't know why I'm not getting this. Sorry. This is a really critical shift in that process, because with that, the Board of Education decided that they would redraft some of the policies, some of the Hawaiian education policies of our public education system that leads to creating space for the development of Hawaiian language arts. Sorry, we call them ana o keapuni, but essentially they're the learning standards that we use to measure student academic achievement for our Hawaiian language immersion students. They are crafted with a crosswalk into our coming core state standards. But I think it was the first time that at the system level, there was an adoption of learning targets that were grounded and created by the community in the language of instruction. So that's a really critical move. The second move was to be able to resource the development of an assessment tool that would be used for federal accountability purposes for those same students in our Hawaiian language immersion schools in 2014. We call that the Ho'ike Kaiapuni Assessment of Educational Outcomes for our students. I think a third particular piece that was important was the adoption of Board of Education Policy E3, Naho Pena'o. This Board of Education policy speaks to the need to think more broadly about the context of education and not just the content of education, and making sure that the outcomes that we're actually heading to are clear, and that we have a way to backwards map the learning design back down into the front end standards-based approach to education. I think that also helps us to sort of contextualize federal accountability assessments and make it more purposeful and clear about why we do it. And then it also allows us to create a bigger space to work towards a different potential about what education in a Hawaii-based education system could really look like. And then finally, while this the Board of Education policy was passed in 2015, the Office of Hawaiian Education in particular worked to develop some learning targets specifically to ensure that students in all students in the Hawaii Department of Education, not just our immersion students, but all students in our public education system have some competencies that they're working towards that are related to the relationship that they would have to this aina, this beloved aina that they're born and raised and educated in. So when all of these policies start to take place and we start to see leadership shift, we start to see the head turn, we had to start asking the questions around, okay, how does the body then start to turn and follow that head? The Office of Hawaiian Education in particular was created in 2015. And what we did was we started to explore, like, what does it mean to now think about outcomes-based education and backwards mapping into standard-based education, and how do we do that? And given the fact that our current accountability system focuses heavily on measuring the learning and what students learn, and not necessarily in a more formative way, assessing for learning to be able to stay sort of iterative and flexible to the shifting landscape of education over time. The Office of Hawaiian Education was recipient of a grant that was sort of, when did that go? I think in 2016. There was a request for learning opportunity that our office decided to apply for. I think the thing that was most intriguing about it was that they were asking us to send a request for learning and not a request for a proposal. The invitation there was really to be a part of a community of practice that was trying to explore how do we shift the mindsets around assessment so that they're not sort of heavily weighted on measuring me or measuring the learner, and including, when we talk about balanced assessments, including the context for where students and folks in communities learn, and then being able to measure sort of the inputs and processes that drive certain outcomes and certain outputs. And so fundamentally, it was an exploration to answer the question, if not just federal accountability, and if not just those academic performance type assessments, then what else do we need to shift to? And I think the answer became this fundamental shift from not just focusing on the me, but also including the we in that assessment approach. Oops, backwards. Oh, how do I go backwards? Sorry, I need to go back one. Yeah, thank you. Through this process, we got to meet this really cool guy. His name is Gary Chapin, and he used to work for CCE, and now he runs this organization called Educating for Good. Gary came to Hawaii in 2018 on a visit to an educational summit that our office had put on. And I think he likes to say that his life was completely transformed, and he had this sort of out-of-body experience when he was here in Hawaii. Particularly, the place where this summit was held was up on the island of Hawaii, in the town of Waimea. And when we went there, the community of Waimea brought their aina, brought their winds, brought their rains, brought everything into the conference, and openly shared that and provided a safe space for people like Gary to be able to engage with a whole different way of thinking about what matters in education. And so at the end of the conference, the summit, Gary's sort of sitting on the side and he's asking us questions, and he says, I wish that and so the group themselves, the invitation was really to be a part of a va'a culture or a voyaging culture, and to use that place at Aina and the practices to think about navigation, not just in sort of on the ocean and in real life and real practice, but sort of as a metaphor for thinking about what does Aina need, what does land need, and how do we navigate sort of that shifting landscape to make sure that we're always nurturing it and taking care of it. And so Gary asked the question at the end of the summit. He said, he had a wondering, he had a wish. He said, I wish that I could belong to the va'a culture of this place, or the voyaging culture of this place. And then a friend of mine, Kalihu said, well, why can't you? Why can't this be a culture? What prevents you from being this culture? I think that's a critical point to make, because it challenges the assumption that that people of a community and people who are not of the community have about whether the sense of belonging can be initiated to be able to include and create safe space for more people to belong. And so Gary walked away wondering about how do you create space that's open and welcoming for those who are going through sort of this transformation, start to feel like they belong. Gary ended up leaving where he was at and started opening up Educating for Good, and working with his colleague, Carissa Caro, probably 3 years later, published this book, 126 Falsehoods We Believe About Education. It's a great exploration, but I think the point that I want to make here is that it is challenging some of the assumptions that we hold about what good education is. And it's asking folks to like really contemplate that and contemplate the belief system behind it, and contemplate whether or not they want to continue to move in that direction, or start to make some shifts at the assumptions level and at the conditions level to create a different look on top of the landscape, or a shift in the behaviors. Back one. Okay, sorry. Thank you. Back many. Is that new? Wait. Sorry, I'm trying to make that move without making it move too far. Okay, there we go. As the Department of Education continues to move forward and start to continue to transform the way we think about education, and particularly in the space where we're trying to make sure that we can preserve a culture that's unique to this place. We're asking ourselves to say these questions, some critical questions around whether or not we're counting what matters. And if we are, then how do we identify what those things are? And then how do we start to create conditions that'll get us to the outcomes that actually matter to us, this place in Hawaii? And then how do we do that? How do we do that in a manner that allows folks to participate as a community, and to contribute the gifts that they bring to that community, so that the whole will benefit, right? And that shift from the me to the we. We think that some of the emerging practice around the work that we explored starting in 2016 with the Assessment for Learning project comes from a specific set of driving mindsets of OHE, what we call P4, or policies, practices, programs, and projects that are grounded in some of these common elements that are going to be essential to defining like what does that practice look like, and what are those strategies around education of P4 look like. Making sure that as we do that, we always put Aina first, and that the gifts that we bring as a community contributes to sustaining Aina and sustaining land. When we wake up in the morning, our operating system should be a we-I operating system and not a me-I operating system. I'm always thinking about how we fit into the larger community. Sort of like when you drop a pebble into the water and it creates this ripple. We are always conscious about the ripple effect we generate, and kind of looking out for, is it in benefit to the greater good? I think sometimes we'll call it Nokopono Kanui. And that when we create tools like Napo Pena'o or the Aina Aloha competencies or the Diana o Kaiapuni, we create them particularly as tools. They are not meant to be the thing that is set in stone in perpetuity. They are meant to change through natural shifts, because nothing stays the same. And so these framework and these tools and these guides, they just sort of add to the toolkit that we have, and that we pull from, and they create some, a form for us to sort of live flexibly inside of, as a community. I think one other emerging element of this practice is, and something that we always look for in terms of indicators, is whether or not we start to see people taking on fully and are taking sort of voluntarily adopting responsibility for something. The first picture when I talked about the fifth generation of folks working in that Aina, that my kupuna what my kupuna originally lived in. When I start to see the fourth, I'm in the third generation, when I start to see the fourth and the fifth generation showing up voluntarily and participating and working and knowing and doing so that Aina can thrive, I think that's when we know that that these kinds of things are the things that are important to us, that the things that we're accounting about what matters is starting to become realized for that next generation, and that shift in terms of knowledge systems are starting to be adopted by the new generation. And so I think some of these emerging practices, I gotta go back one. I think I might have missed one. Oh, it's not going back. Anyways, so focusing on outcomes in the assessment design, I think is going to be important. I think oftentimes, particularly in the Department of Education, we spend a lot of time trying to figure out whether or not a student in third grade at the state level, right? They want to know whether or not every single student at the state in the third grade has certain abilities to read and write. But we always ask the question about what we would do with that knowledge, that data. What do we do with it? Do we just say, oh, they can't read and write, it does this, we'll make them read and write more? Or are we actually thinking about, if the student cannot read and write, how does that then affect his or her outcomes? And might we be able to design differently so that if that is an essential need, that we can put it into context and make sure that he can adopt those skills from the space of comfortability that he or she sits in. And so making sure that we're also focusing on outcomes when we're designing the assessment tools that allow us to get to measuring what matters. Those are some of the, so I think there's a couple of other slides, but I can't make this thing shift. So I'm gonna go ahead and skip by that. I think in closing, I just wanna say, oh yeah, there we go. In closing, I think I want to point out that there's this idea of communities of practice. They're not just tools to be able to sort of develop something and then let it go. That community of practice is something that should live in perpetuity, because the outcome of being able to function and develop relationships that are long lasting because of that community of practice allows us to sustain the we. And when we sort of translate back down into some of the tools that we've created to do that, we create sort of, we start to work towards reclaiming like who gets to make the decisions about what shows up in the learning design of our communities. And so being able to hold hands through that process and continue to sustain, I mean, the word we use here is continue to practice. The word I would apply to that is sustaining ohana, or sustaining family, I think becomes more important than the work that we do or the trying to work towards that that deliverable that the community is working towards. I think essentially it's about relationships being the end and not the means to things. I think finally, the way we start to approach our education system and the design of the way we do education has to be more considerate of and applying ecosystems thinking in assessment, so that we're not just measuring and doing an assessment of the learning, but we also have practices that assess for the learning as a way to think about content and context, and to be able to shift some of the front end things of inputs and processes to see if it might drive to different data that we see in the assessment of learning. And so when we think about balanced assessments, I'm thinking about applying that practice at the state level of measuring context and content. At the complex level, I think you guys said state and district. So I would apply the complex level as a district level here in Hawaii, using that same approach of measuring context and content, and then giving strategies even at the classroom level and school level for folks to also think about how do they make sure that they're measuring context and context within any kind of assessment design. Not having different practices, but being more purposeful about why those things matter. Why the culture, why the context of learning is just as important as the content that we use and that we teach in our education systems. That is sort of the way in which we took an approach towards the development of our foreign language assessment tool that we use for federal accountability. And fortunately for us, we were able to use that practice back in 2013 and build that up towards a more systems level approach, a systems level thinking tool around influencing overall assessment practices in the public education system. We are still working on that as a department and working to get better at it. I just want to leave with one quote that I often turn to when I'm doing presentations like this. And when I sit in spaces where I may or may not necessarily sound or the language that I'm using sounds familiar to others, but the quote I usually refer to is "Na vai ho'i ka ole o kia ka mai, he ala I ma'a I ka hele ia ka uma kupuna," essentially saying, why would I not look and be comfortable with the path that I'm on, and with the way to do things? It's something that's so familiar to me because of my kupuna. And the practices that they hold. I think essentially what we're trying to do in our public education system through the Office of Higher Education is to make sure that we're looking back at the ways of our kupuna, and trying to make sure that the department makes space for the ways of our kupuna to exist for the benefit of all of the KPL Hawaii. And so with that, I leave you with that question, and I leave you with the question about whether or not, about this idea of being able to think about, are you counting what matters? Are you measuring what matters? And if not, what do you do about it? And so with that, I want to say mahalo. I know, I think we're like way out of time. I don't think we have time for questions, but thank you very much for including me in this.
Kawi, thank you so much. And Erika and Carla, thank you so much too. Let's take a moment now to see if there are any additional questions that have come in. Participants, if you have questions for Kawi, Erika, Carla, please feel free to put them in the chat box. We are also going to be posting in the chat, Kirsten Miller will post in the chat, a link to a feedback survey about today's session. So please do take some time. It's just a brief survey, but it'll give us some good feedback that we can use to help plan and prepare and deliver future sessions through the REL Pacific. So Kirsten, if you could also take a look at questions that have come in, and if there are outstanding questions that we still need to address, if you could let us know, and we'll take a few minutes now to answer those.
Sure. So I did go ahead and put the survey link in the chat for everyone. That it's really just two questions, two scaled questions, and then a few open-ended questions. So it should be very quick. And we did get a lot of engagement in the chat. So I appreciate everyone who has hung in there with us and can take a few more minutes to discuss some of those questions. There was a lot of good There were a lot of good comments also. So some of the remaining questions that we have were really around this is a question for Cowie around the largest issues you see facing students in Hawaii in comparison to mainland students. And we have so many questions. I'm not sure that we'll be able to get to all of them while everyone can stay with us. But we can also go ahead and compile those and share those via email once we wrap up today. All right, Cowie, did you want to speak to that?
Sure. I think that given that Hawaii was an independent nation and then became colonized, I think that introduced automatically sort of a political upheaval that continues to sort of run in the current below the way government applies practices. And so there's always going to be sort of this participation of community through politics in trying to drive what happens in public institutions like the Department of Education. But inclusive in that is the fact that for a very long time, starting in the late 1800s, there was an introduction of all kinds of cultures into Hawaii. And before Hawaii's, during the time when our monarchy was the ruling government of this place, there was room for all of those languages to exist in harmony. There was room for the people to be able to contribute and assemble the gifts that they have and contribute to the benefit of the whole. I think once there was a shift away from that kind of abundance mindset and into like everybody's got to fit into one box. I think that's when we start to see some issues around sort of people now claiming for the me rather than holding space for the we. And so throughout, I think, Hawaii's education system, throughout the years of Hawaii's education system, we start to see that kind of the ebb and flow of that in terms of practice around, do we do for all, do we do for some, do we impose practices that appreciate the cultures of everyone, of all of the people in this space, or do we just continue to drive a single mindset? I think the Lanakila or the what is Lanakila Makaʻolohale? How do you say it in Hawaii? I think the dominant culture became the target around pointing at English competency as the success indicator for all students. And so once that starts to happen, people start to lose their footing around the cultures that they come from. And so that when we ask this question about the difference between what's happening on the continent and what's happening here in Hawaii, I would only say that maybe in Hawaii, when we look at what's happening in our public education system, where 28% of our students are Native Hawaiian, and they fill up the achievement gap data sets, we've got to be able to, one, take care of them because they can't go anywhere else to be Hawaii. This is Hawaii. We have to make sure that we're considering that practice. But I think the other thing is whether or not we might be able to learn as a system from those kupuna or those the indigenous culture of this place that would allow, in terms of the practices and strategies that they use, would allow a space that creates a sense of belonging for all cultures to be able to thrive, and then to live in a different kind of abundance, because the normalized outcome becomes a contribution to the we. And so I think I would say that the difference between what's happening in here in Hawaii and what's happening on the continent might be centered around that question of whether or not there's room to appreciate cultures, and then how we do that in the different spaces that we come from. I don't know, I hope that.
Thank you so much, Kawi. Yeah. Thank you. Erika and Carlo, I saw that one of the questions that was posed from registrants, they were wondering about the connection between supporting social and emotional learning with this idea of culturally relevant and sustaining teaching and assessment. Can you speak a little bit to that, about the connection points?
I mean, I'll say one thing and I'll let Erika say something. I mean, we're whole people. So we can't really separate our emotions from what's happening with our learning systems, whether that's activities, as Kawi so eloquently you talked about, like how even what's measured and what's valued and what's set up as the ultimate goal. So I think that they're completely intertwined, and that we're socio-cultural beings, and to the extent that we change how we think about instruction and assessment in more culturally responsive ways, I think that students can connect their social identities and their cultural identities and their academic identities in a more seamless way, rather than having to code switch and kind of separate out their, emotional identities, if you will. Erika, I don't know what you want to add.
I don't have anything to add to that. I think that was a great response.
All right. Well, thank you again to all three of you, to Carla, Erika, and Kawi. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you everybody else who joined in from around the world, really, with today's session. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you for lending to our panelists. Thank you for lending your time and your insights. If any of our participants and registrants would like to connect with you, we've included your contact information in the PowerPoint, which we'll be sharing out with everyone later. So to everyone listening to the session, please feel free to reach out to any of our guests if you'd like to ask them follow-up questions or continue the conversation after today. With that, I think we will draw today's session to a close. Once again, thank you all for joining us, and we wish you the very best for the rest of your day. Thank you and goodbye.